Thank you all so much for being here. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes.
Good. It is really an honor for me to be here to talk with Andrew Lawler. And as always, a huge pleasure to work with Malaprops and to be in this great space here. We want to thank, once again, but heartfelt, Congregation Beth Israel, and also Jay Jacoby, who helped organize this event and host it. So thank you very much for doing this. I'm going to introduce Andrew, also a pleasure. And I'm going to ask him a few questions that I think are at the heart of this wonderful book we're here to talk about tonight. And then Andrew is going to give his presentation, which I've been looking forward to for days. So it's a really special pleasure for me to introduce Andrew Lawler. He is not only a wonderful writer, but a wonderful friend. And in many ways, the conversation we will be having is a continuation of years now, I think, of actually talking about books, writing, reading, and historical research, which will be a big part of tonight. So I want to tell you a little bit about him. He is the author of 3 books, including this book, Under Jerusalem, which I hope you will all purchase before you leave. And it is a fantastic read. And he has also written 2 other books. One is The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke, which was a national bestseller. And also a nonfiction book, a 3rd nonfiction book, his first book, right? Which has, I think, one of the killer titles of all time. Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? The Epic Saga of the Bird That Powers Civilization. So think about that next time you eat chicken. You do eat chicken. I highly recommend these books. As a journalist, Andrew has written more than 1,000 newspaper and magazine articles from more than 24 countries. His byline has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, the Smithsonian magazine, and many others. He is a contributing writer to Science magazine, and interestingly for tonight's presentation, a contributing editor for Archaeology magazine. His work has appeared several times in the Best of Science and Nature Writing. He is a Renaissance man, a delightful friend. He lives here in Asheville, but as you can tell, he travels the world at the drop of a hat. And please welcome Andrew Lawler. Andrew, I'm going to ask you several questions that I think are extremely important for this book. And there are things we've talked about a little bit over the years as you've been writing and researching it. Every book has a story behind it. And I'm wondering, how did you come to write this particular book? And was there a single moment when you thought, this is going to be a book, an aha moment, or maybe several pivotal moments?
Well, I don't know about you, but I get a certain feeling when I know I'm going to write a book. It's a sinking feeling of despair. Oh no, not this. And inevitably, the ones that I'm like, oh, I'd love to do that, they never work out. But the ones where I go, oh no. So my oh no moment was, I'd been to Jerusalem many times for meetings. I've written a couple of archaeology stories, but in covering archaeology in the Middle East, I had really avoided Jerusalem because frankly, it's intimidating. There's so much politics and religion, but at some point a few years ago, I was at a conference in Jerusalem and an archaeologist friend of mine said, hey, you want to go to lunch and maybe we'll walk around town. I said, sure, that sounds fun. He was somebody who liked a good meal and nice wine. So I thought, okay, we'll have a long leisurely lunch and then take a stroll. Well, 6 hours later, we were still underground and I never got lunch that day. He took me into places I had no idea existed, into tunnels and tombs and all kinds of places, introduced me to the archaeologists who were working there at the time. And as we were walking through, periodically the archaeologists would say, oh, and you see this tunnel here, this entrance to this tunnel, that was dug by a British archaeologist in the 1860s. I thought, wow, that's interesting. And the more I was hearing these stories from current day archaeologists, the more I wanted to know more about how this all got started, because I'm interested in origins. The origin of the chicken, the origin of our country in the form of the Lost Colony. How did Jerusalem get to be the contested, violent, controversial place that it is today? And so at the end of that day, I had that sinking feeling of, oh my God, I've avoided Jerusalem for all these years, and now I'm going to have to actually write about it.
I love that, the oh no moment. I have to agree with that of writing projects. So this actually takes us right into my next question, and you touched on it a little bit, but I want to dig a little bit more appropriately. So you have a way of taking on not only big research topics, but rather controversial topics in your work, and especially in these last two books. And so in The Secret Token, you took on national myth making, everything from Southern history to white supremacism to the way we have made myths about the origins of our country, as you mentioned. And I think the chicken's a little less controversial, but you managed to make it. You managed to make it spicy, so to speak. So that was also, yes, I agree. There was a little controversy there, but you seem to be upping your game with each book in terms of hot topics. And in this book about Jerusalem, you take on not only archaeology, but inevitably some history, some politics, some explosive topics sometimes. And I'm wondering if you could share with us what specifically in your personal and professional experience really prepared you to write this particular book.
Well, in my experience, at least, nothing prepares you to write a book, because you always think you know what you're going to write about, and in the end, you're writing about something completely different. So that's part of the journey, right? And part of where you don't want to tell the publisher too much because you're going to end up in a different place. I mean, obviously, being in the Middle East a lot, going back and forth and writing about archaeological digs in the Middle East was good preparation. I knew how to talk to archaeologists. I knew how to speak their jargon. I was comfortable with being at a dig site. But the politics and the religious part of it were pretty challenging. I went to a meeting of it was a Jewish rabbi who had formed a group, an ecumenical group, trying to get Muslims, Christians, and Jews together in Jerusalem to pray together. Pretty radical. And at some point, we were walking out of one meeting. He said, "Why are you here?" And I was really caught up short because I didn't have a good answer. He just kept walking because he knew I didn't have an answer. I didn't really know why I was there or how to be there. So the challenge was to walk into Jerusalem, as everyone does. I had my own story, my own beliefs, my own idea of this place. And to try and be aware enough of that so I could set it aside and then just talk to as many people as possible and hear them as clearly as I could, and just try to remove the filters that were in my mind. And so that was always working as I was on this project. And of course, I'm sure I'm not completely successful, but there was that kind of inner journey that I feel like I had to take in order to come back with something valuable and fresh that wasn't just yet another story about, another narrative about Jerusalem.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds as if a lot of your journalist experience, your reporting, your many years of interviewing must have helped you a lot in that, attempt to step back and be somewhat objective at least. So my final question before we go to your wonderful PowerPoint here is, this is just something I'm really curious about as I read your book, and also as we've talked about it over the years. You have told me that you went to Jerusalem at least 10 times for this project, and that sometimes you were living in the old city for 2 to 3 weeks. And I'm just wondering, and I'm sure you'll share more about this in your presentation, but I'm wondering what was it like for you to live in the old city, even temporarily?
Well, one thing I learned quickly was that in Jerusalem, everything is political. So if somebody said, "Where are you staying?" It wasn't just "Where are you staying?" It was "Where are you staying?" So are you in the Jewish quarter? Are you in the Armenian quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter? And where you, what you answered would kind of peg you. So I decided I wanted to live in the old city because partly because the commute was easy, because all the digs were there, but also because I wanted to have the experience of being within this walled city. And to experience it not just during archaeological hours, but during the evenings and the mornings, and to really get the full sense of what it's like to live there. Because this is a living city. You have tons and tons of tourists, but you also have people that are out buying their kid a backpack for school and buying food for dinner. And it really is one of the few living cities left that is a walled city that combines this weird kind of tourism and pilgrims along with the day-to-day living. So I found a really nice Christian family in the Christian quarter and stayed there. And they were just lovely people who showed me around, taught me a little about what was where, how to find a grocery store. More on that grocery store in a moment. And gradually I got a feel for a place where there's day-to-day life that's happening like anywhere, and yet there's a level of tension that after 3 weeks I had to get out. I literally had to get on that plane and leave. And I can't describe it except to say that there's an intensity there, may sound obvious, that made it difficult to continue without feeling constantly exhausted. So I'd go away, come back to Asheville, have a little R&R, and then I'd go back.
Thank you. And I remember seeing you in Asheville between trips a couple of times, and how you were coming down off that intensity. And I think that's a very good point, actually, at which we can stop and let you show us some of what you saw there. So thank you, and looking forward to this.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Okay, so thanks again to Elizabeth for, she sent me an email about 4 days ago and said, "Hey, I'm coming to your talk and bring a couple friends." Foolishly, because then I'm like, "Hey, would you mind?" So I want to thank her again for doing that Q&A on such short notice. All right, so let's launch into, I have some slides, and there's some really great images here by a National Geographic photographer I work with. I did a story for Geographic December of 2019, that issue. And Simon Norfolk graciously allowed me to use many of his images. So a lot of these have not been published, and some of them are just fantastic. So I hope that you will enjoy them. Are we ready on that end, Stephanie? Okay, so first of all, well, let me ask this. How many people have been to Jerusalem in this room? Okay, so it's a really good number, maybe like a third or more. But for those of you who have not, it's a good idea to just get a feel for where this place is, because its placement is critical to understanding why Jerusalem has been so central to the world for so long. Now you see we're coming down this image, satellite image, we're coming down to the Middle East. Of course, there's Egypt to the left, Mesopotamia to the right, Iraq today. There's the Dead Sea. We're going right above the Judean highlands, right down, boom. Wow. And what you see there, that rectangle, is the city's Acropolis, known to Jews and Christians as the Temple Mount, and it's known as the Haram al-Sharif, or noble sanctuary to Muslims. And that is a place at the heart of Jerusalem, its history, and today's controversies as well. Okay, this is obvious, I know, but sometimes as a reporter, I know you want to ask dumb questions, say the obvious thing. And the question is, why is Jerusalem so famous? Well, clearly because more than half the planet considers it one of the most important places on earth. And that includes Judaism, which considers the Western Wall, formerly known as the Wailing Wall, which is part of that great Acropolis that I showed you before from space. That's a place they go to worship. A 5-minute walk away on the platform itself is the Dome of the Rock, which is Islam's third holiest site. For Muslims, this is a place where the Prophet Muhammad made a mystical journey up into the heavens. And also by Jewish and Christian tradition, this is a place that covers the site of the original Jewish temples, the last of which was destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. So a very, very important site in world religious history. And then up above, you have another 10-minute walk up the hill is the Holy Sepulchre. And this is a place where, by tradition, Jesus was both crucified and then buried. And you see, this is a photo that Simon Norfolk took at great danger to his life, because he was up there in the cupola on Easter Saturday, right before Easter Sunday, when there's this big event by Greek Orthodox. And that's the tomb of Jesus, the traditional tomb of Jesus right there in the center. So you see, you've got this intensity, plus you have hundreds of smaller churches and synagogues and shrines and tombs that are sacred either to one or two or to all three faiths. And keep in mind, okay, there's Central Park. You see the reservoir? You could practically drop the old city shown on the right into that reservoir. I mean, this is a very small area. So when I talk about intensity, that's part of it, is that every inch has a story. And I like to start with geology because I visited a lot of sites in the Middle East. They tend to be layer cakes of levels of habitation. So the old stuff's on the bottom, and then you build a new house, and it's kind of a stacked place. But Jerusalem's different because it's built on limestone. And as a result, this stone was used to quarry, and there was very little timber, so people built arched structures. And arched structures are very strong and last a long time. So your first floor might eventually become a basement or a cistern or a trash dump, and you build a new house on top of it, a new set of arches. So as Charles Warren, who we'll meet momentarily, said, you can say the Holy City never sleeps because these arches are underneath. So you have layers and layers and layers of these going back thousands of years, which is very unlike other places in the Middle East. And I promised I'd mention that grocery store. So one day I went in my grocery store, just down the street from where I was staying, and the owner said, "Who are you? You're not a tourist, you're hanging out here a lot." And I told him who I was, and he just laughed, walked over to the potato chip aisle, lifted up the hatch, and vanished down it. So I put my bag of groceries down, and I followed him. What else are you gonna do? And with our iPhone lights, we looked around, and I was, oh my God, I'm standing in this enormous vaulted Crusader-era hall that was twice as big as this room, maybe 3 times as big as this room, and nearly as high. And it had recently been dug out by Coptic monks, such as this gentleman on the right here, who reclaimed it as theirs, because the Holy Sepulchre is right next door. And the Muslim shop owner said, "No, it's mine." So there was a little scuffle, a little fight. It became a whole chapter in my book because it turned into a 20-year legal battle over who owned this incredibly valuable ancient space. And this is just the local grocery store. All right, so here's the serious history slide. There's only one, but it's important. And it's really simple. Jerusalem has 5 millennia. And the first 2 millennia are Bronze Age peoples, Egyptians, Canaanites, people we don't know much about, but they created Jerusalem into what we know today. And there was a spring on the side of the hill there that provided water, and there was plenty of stone to build, so it became a good-sized town, not major, but a good-sized town. Then you get to what most of us know, I call it the biblical millennium. So this is when not only was most of the Hebrew Bible written, but a lot of the events occurred. Begins with the traditional story of King David arriving, conquering Jerusalem from the Canaanites. The Israelites settle there, becomes the Judean capital. And of course, in the course of this 1,000 years, lots of stuff happens. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, I mean, they're just people passing through. So complex history, but this is the core of the history that most of us know about. We don't know as much, or we tend not to pay as much attention to the last 2 millennia of the history, in which the Romans rebuild Jerusalem after destroying it in 70 CE. And you have Persians arrive, the Christian Byzantines turn it into a very prosperous city. The Muslims arrive and take it over. And then you have Crusaders taking it over, the Ottomans who come in for the last 500 years. Pretty good on Jerusalem's history in less than 2 minutes in one slide. But so this is the meat of the book that I realized didn't exist. And so this is why I had to write the book, because I kept looking for this book and it wasn't there. How did Jerusalem's archaeology get started? And what impact did it have on the politics and religious controversies today? And what I discovered was this guy named Félicien de Sauzet, who was a French senator and good friend of the Emperor Napoleon III, head of the French Empire. He got the first dig permit. And the Sultan didn't care about the Bible, didn't care about science or finding stuff in the Bible, but he did care about the French being friends with the Ottomans. So de Sauzet got a permit, began to dig at the Tomb of the Kings, which was, still is, the largest, most elaborate tomb in Jerusalem. And he found a sarcophagus, which had remains in it of clearly a woman who was royal. He declared it to be a Judean queen from the Bible, hauled it back to the Louvre, where it became a sensation. I call it the French Sputnik because it was like the King Tut exhibit. And the French said, hey, we're the first ones to find the remains of the Bible. And this was big news back then. Now, it also really upset the Jewish community because they said, wait a second, these are our ancestors. You're desecrating our land. You are Christian heretics showing up, digging this thing up. And so it didn't reflect well either on the French or the Ottomans from the perspective of the Jewish community. Now, the British, much like the Americans 100 years later, when it came to the race to the moon, started off late, but they came on strong. So they set up a fund, they sent archaeologists, although archaeology then was still more exploration. And these were mostly British military officers. So this was really a British military expedition that was lightly portrayed as something civilian. And they began to really map what was under Jerusalem. And this guy, Charles Warren, you saw his quote earlier, was the one who did more than any single person in the history of Jerusalem archaeology. He really got in there and dug. Here's a tunnel, Western Wall tunnel, part of that. My producer just filmed this a couple weeks ago. And this was filled with sewage, so we had to make a boat to sail through this. And you see the height of it, and that's the street above. So you get a sense of, the engineering that went into building these things, and also the difficulty in accessing them. And you can see here, underneath the Acropolis, the Temple Mount, the sanctuary, is this incredible cistern that Warren explored, but then was covered over, and Muslims who were they weren't happy with Christians poking around in their ancient sites, they put it off limits. But Warren was able to discover quite a bit about the city. And he also used, let's say, questionable methods like gunpowder. Dynamite had not quite been invented. He used gunpowder to blast his way through these tunnels. Now, people are living them up, and they weren't very happy. Imagine if you're home and people are blowing things up, and there was concern in the Muslim community that the true goal was for the British to destroy the noble sanctuary. So from the beginning, archaeology was not welcomed by either the Jewish or the Muslim communities. So by the 1890s, the big question became, where was the city of David? Now, the city of David was the original city that King David and King Solomon, according to the Bible, they came in, they took it over from the Canaanites, right? The trouble was there was no evidence for any of it. Archaeologists could not find it. They couldn't even find out where it was originally located. It didn't seem to be in the old city, shown there in pink, but let's see if I can use my cursor here. So they began, these two guys, Bliss and Dickey, were shown there at the bottom. I'm not sure who's who. They have the same droopy Victorian mustaches. So I apologize, but anyway, trust me, they're Bliss and Dickey or Dickey and Bliss. And they dug for several years and finally determined that this little bit of land that came down from the noble sanctuary was actually the original city of David. But the trouble was, it was a city of David from a later period. It wasn't from those original 2, 3, or 4 centuries. So there's no sign of Solomon's tomb, for example, shown here in a drawing by a painting by a European. There was no sign of the Ark of the Covenant, which some believe was hidden in tunnels beneath the city of David. So this was a problem, but it also was an opportunity for other explorers to arrive in Jerusalem, such as my favorite person in this whole story. I shouldn't have favorites, but this man, Montague Brownlow Parker, was a British aristocrat who teams up with a Finnish poet and theologian who believed he had cracked a secret code in the Bible, a Kabbalistic code, that told him exactly where the temple treasures were. The temple treasures were allegedly hidden when the Babylonians arrived in 586 BC, and the question was, where was this stuff? And it wasn't just a matter of finding sacred things, the Ark of the Covenant, the gold and silver vessels. When you added all this material up, Parker estimated it would be worth something like $3 billion in today's market. So this was really valuable treasure. So they had a subscription and they got money from Europeans and Americans to go dig. Of course, the one thing they forgot to hire an archaeologist. Details. And as a result, they mucked around, they did a lot of digging. They brought in the engineer who actually created the London tube system to dig more tunnels. And finally, desperate, Parker bribed the guard on the sacred Acropolis, on the Haram al-Sharif, so that he could go in with some of his guys in the middle of the night and hammer away at the rock under the dome of the rock. The place Muhammad got up to heaven, the place that maybe Abraham would sacrifice, or Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, a place that is of probably more tremendous religious importance than any single stone on earth. Of course, he was discovered. And a mob chased them out of town. They got on their yacht in Jaffa, sailed away. And how they sailed away, I mean, that is a story in and of itself. But this incident was treated kind of as a comic opera, you know, how silly, how ridiculous. But it had important implications that until recently were not understood. And that is, the Ottomans had allowed the British to come in and, in the view of the people in Jerusalem, desecrate the noble sanctuary. So the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs who lived there, were not happy with the Ottomans. And they realized that in order to protect their important holy shrine, they couldn't trust the Ottomans. And this was the beginning of Arab-Palestinian nationalism. This idea that we can't trust the outsiders, we have to be able to protect Islam's third holy site. So that had enormous implications for what would come in the subsequent century. And meanwhile, it wasn't just the British and the French or the Germans and the Russians who were competing to dig up biblical remains. It also sparked the interest of the Jewish community in Europe. Quite reasonably, they said, wait a second, this is our heritage. Why are these Christians digging up our biblical heritage? So a couple of people, including Baron Edmund Rothschild, who was a wealthy French banker, he put together a team with a very distinguished French-Jewish archaeologist named Raymond Lodge, and they began to dig.
Now, the cover story was, we're looking for the tomb of David and Solomon. But what they really were looking for is exactly what Parker was looking for, and that is the Ark of the Covenant. They did not want the Ark of the Covenant to fall into Christian hands. And Rothschild later told somebody, he said, excavations be damned, its possession counts. So this is more than science. This is even more than nationalism. This is really about religious identity and who can control the biblical story. Now, very quickly, let's just say the 20th century in Jerusalem was a real mess. The first half in particular. So the British finally do get control of Jerusalem when the Ottoman Empire collapses at the end of World War I. But it turns out to be not the wonderful thing they thought it would be. Because, of course, as Jewish immigrants are coming into Israel, to what's then called Palestine, the fights begin. And there are terrible riots, there's communal tension, and for the next 20 years, things are pretty grim in Jerusalem. So who owns the city? This is the big question. The British finally step out, and they say, we're done. And Israel is created by the United Nations, a war ensues with the Arab neighbors, and in the end of this, Jerusalem is divided, much like Berlin was divided 20 years later, with barbed wire right down the middle. The eastern part belongs to Jordan. The western part is the capital of Israel, West Jerusalem. And that's where things stand until 1967. So before then, not a whole lot of archaeology took place because there was so much fighting going on, nobody really gave much thought to digging. But after 67, the Israelis were in control now of the entire old city and all of Jerusalem, not just the western part, because all the really old stuff was in East Jerusalem. So this launched a whole new era, which is very important in Jerusalem's history. And archaeology is funny. You know, you can set out to look for what you want and find it. And Benjamin Bazar on the left did. He set out, very distinguished archaeologist, the president of Hebrew University. He set out to find the magnificent metropolis of Herod the Great. So we're talking the 1st century BC, just before the time of Jesus. And Herod had completely rebuilt the city. We knew this from documents, but there wasn't a whole lot of evidence. So when he dug, in fact, he did find tremendous evidence, such as the largest pedestrian interchange in the ancient world. This is the Temple Mount during that period, renovated in a very classical style, popular then. So that wasn't a big surprise, but it really gave a boost to those Israelis who claimed Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the Jews. Because here's the evidence, we have the proof. This was a major, important Jewish city. But then Meyer Ben Dov, this gentleman in blue, who was a colleague of Benjamin Bazar, he did some digging too. On the south side of the sanctuary, of the noble sanctuary, the Temple Mount, the Acropolis. And what he found really blew the socks off of nearly everybody. Because the story was that the Muslims arrived, in the 7th century, not long after the death of Muhammad, they built the Dome of the Rock, see up there, and they built Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque there you see on the right side. But then they never really considered Jerusalem that important. So that was an argument that, well, for Arabs, Jerusalem's not really that significant. But Ben Dov found 6 tremendous palaces that were built right after the death of Muhammad by early Islamic rulers. And when he consulted with one of his colleagues, he said, hey, you wouldn't believe what I found. The colleague said, this is from Ben Dov, the colleague said, you got a bulldozer? And Ben Dov said, what do you mean? He said, wipe him out. We don't want that history. Now, Ben Dov, to his great credit, said absolutely not. And he went and broadcast the news that night so that there would be no question of it being destroyed. And it also worked ultimately to the advantage of the Israeli archaeology community, because it showed that they were interested in the history of everybody, not just the Jews. So it did give a boost, but it remains a very controversial topic. And the other piece is the rabbinic tunnel. So while these digs are going on from 67 into the 70s, a secret project was underway. And it was a project undertaken not by archaeologists, but by rabbis. Now, the Western Wall, you remember when I mentioned Charles Warren, and that tunnel I showed you, that kind of curving tunnel. Well, that was part of his exploration of the area on the Western Wall and the foundations. Now, this Rabbi Getz, you can see him here on the left, he had an idea. He said, well, why don't we dig a tunnel underneath the Western Wall that follows it, parallels it? And we're talking about a tunnel that's about the same size as the Empire State Building is high. This is a very long wall. So they began secretly to dig along the foundations of the Western Wall. Why secretly? Well, because the Muslim quarter was above. And of course, Warren had gotten in trouble in doing so, using gunpowder and such, and he really angered the Muslim community. So now it's almost exactly 100 years later, here are Israeli rabbis doing the same. And they managed to complete the tunnel. Let me give you a little, I'll give you a little video there. These are some of the foundation stones up there in the top right there. Just gives you a sense of the scale. I mean, these are enormous blocks that were put in place probably about the time of Herod in the 1st century CE. And there's part of the original, or part of the tunnel that the rabbis built that went further to the north. And when they did complete this tunnel, you see the map on the left there, they opened an entrance here in 1996, and when a young prime minister named Benjamin Netanyahu had just come to power. And in the resulting furor, more than 100 people were killed, thousands of people were injured, and it was the beginning of the end, if you will, for the Oslo peace talks that were designed to create a Palestinian state and to end the conflict between Jews and Muslims, between Israelis and Jewish Israelis and Arabs. Unfortunately, that tunnel, which was set up as a place for people to go pray, turned into a major political problem, which to this day remains a big stumbling block in determining how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Who owns this? It's a very hot topic. So very quickly, because my time is going to come to an end shortly, but in the 1990s, archaeologists went back to that little piece of land called the city of David. And the purpose was to try and understand more about this area, but also specifically to find remains from the time of David and Solomon. It was driving Israeli archaeologists crazy. Where was the great city described in the Bible that Solomon had glorified? Queen of Sheba came to visit him. There was a palace with a crystal floor. Where was this stuff? So there was nothing but a lot of massive Bronze Age, that is from the period before the Israelites, construction until 2005, when this lady, Elat Mazar, a very distinguished Israeli archaeologist who unfortunately passed away in May, made an astounding discovery. And you see it here in blue. This palace, or this room, or these chambers she found, this building, she claimed, based on dating the pottery and on other circumstantial evidence, she claimed that it was in fact the very palace of David. This was sensational news, because for hundreds of years, people have been looking for something from the time of David. Here it was, or so she claimed, because archaeologists very quickly jumped on her evidence and said, no, this is actually not dated to about between 1000 and 900 BCE. That this is actually a later construction. It remains a very hot topic, but it shows you that what you find in Jerusalem about the past has an immediate influence on what is happening above. And this is a more recent, I spent a lot of time in this tunnel here. So the Romans, in Roman times, so the time of Herod the Great, or slightly later, an enormous structure, an enormous monumental street was built that no one fully knew about. And it went from the base of that city of David Hill all the way up to the Temple Mount. a really massive piece of construction that was buried deep underneath what is today largely a Muslim neighborhood. So the City of David Foundation began to dig with the help of Israeli archaeologists, and they built basically a subway tunnel underneath this part of the city that exposed the street. And one thing that was fascinating was that most people assumed Herod the Great built this, right? He was a Jewish king, he wanted to glorify Judaism, and so of course it's Herod. Well, actually no. The coins show very clearly this was built during the time when a Roman governor was in charge of Jerusalem, and his name was Pontius Pilate, a man despised throughout history by Jews as well as Christians, as someone who didn't respect Judaism. But again, archaeology is showing us something subtler than the text shows us. It's showing us that this man, for whatever reason, wanted to glorify Judaism, wanted to glorify Jerusalem, and spent a good deal of time and effort and money to build this massive road, which obviously was used by pilgrims, Jewish pilgrims going up to the Temple Mount, as well as the local people. So it really turns on its head our ideas about who the Romans were in Jerusalem at this time, because they're always considered to be, the bad guys, the enemies. Like, well, yes, they were, but they also were doing things that seem to contradict that rather simplistic notion. Very quickly, I'll just mention there's another dig going on across the street at what's called the Gobachi parking lot. You can see just south of the Acropolis. And there have been some tremendous finds. I have an article coming out in Archaeology magazine next month about this. It gives more detail. But these finds are revealing eras of Jerusalem for which we had absolutely no physical evidence. The time of the Persians, when scholars think much of the Old Testament was written, as well as from Hellenistic time, the time of Hanukkah, which is coming on soon. So these are very important eras for which we had no archaeological evidence. And the evidence is very interesting. For example, there's that round medallion there is of Athena. Here's a Greek figure, a Greek deity that's located just south of the sacred Jewish temple enclosure. Also, there's some images of faces, which you would think would not be okay in a culture where graven images were taboo, as well as lots of animals, gold earrings. But what they show is that Jerusalem was a way more complicated and interesting place, that there were cultures moving in and out of this area, that Jerusalem was not a city on the hill that had little interaction except for the occasional barbarian coming through and destroying it. Actually, the religious innovation of Jerusalem comes about clearly through these interactions in a very active and dynamic Middle East. Speaking of active and dynamic Middle East, what I learned in my time in Jerusalem was that as much as archaeologists tend to want to just do their science, you can't ignore the political and religious impact of these digs. And there are many reasons for that. The patrons, such as the City of David Foundation, that are largely funding these efforts, are highly controversial. The City of David Foundation is actively and openly wanting to bring Jewish settlers in to replace the Muslims who live in that particular neighborhood. This is very controversial and has led to all kinds of violence. Also, the Palestinians I spoke with who lived upstairs, such as this man to the left, Abdel Arafat, complain that their houses are falling apart, that the tunneling has created damage to their foundations. So, and I should say the City of David Foundation denies that their work is having any effect on the houses above. And finally, there's this very touchy question about, are these excavations even legal? Because under the international regime, East Jerusalem is still conquered territory. And under international law, you can't dig in somebody else's territory without their approval. And the Palestinians certainly have not granted that approval. But the Israelis argue that we've annexed Jerusalem. It's not conquered territory. It's now part of our country. So there's a real divide there in how to even see whether these excavations should be done at all. So just to sum up, and then we'll get to your questions, I think the big thing I learned was my big aha, my big surprise, when I asked the question, how did Jerusalem get to be such a mess? Well, it turns out it was the Western Christians who were looking for the remains of the Bible who kind of lit the fire. And in doing this, and bringing back those remains to the Louvre, to the British Museum, and elsewhere, they were able to inspire a lot of Jewish Europeans who were in the midst of forming this idea of Zionism and returning to Israel, returning back to their ancient homeland. So it was the Western Christians who inspired them, and they got involved then with the archaeology. And ultimately, and we see where that led to this conflict as to who owns Jerusalem, which was not a conflict that you would have encountered before these archaeologists appeared. Now, the other piece, which is very touchy, is because a lot of these archaeologists I met, I liked and respected them. And I also felt sorry for them because many of them face these really difficult ethical dilemmas. Getting a job in archaeology is hard, and keeping a job is hard. It's hard work. You got to work a lot of strange hours, and there are not many positions. So biblical Jerusalem still draws people's attention. In fact, did anybody see that article last month about the toilet found in Jerusalem? It's a 2,700-year-old toilet found in Jerusalem, made some headlines. Well, the only reason I made a headline was because it happened during the biblical millennium. It's associated with the Bible. And that gets media attention. People like me write about it, editors that I have want me to write about it, and then donors who pay for archaeological excavations, which are very expensive, are the ones who then get interested and want to fund these digs. So if you're an archaeologist, you might like the Neolithic, but it's really the biblical stuff that pays. It will give you the money you need to do your digs. And then you've got this question of, are the digs even legal if they're in East Jerusalem? And like I say, this is there's no easy answer here. I certainly don't have an answer, but I think it's worth raising these questions and issues if we want to really understand the science. And speaking of the science, well, if anybody stands up in front of you and says that they have an answer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, run for the doors. Now's your chance. Okay, nobody left. So this is probably very naive, but I did come away with this very strong feeling. There's no evidence, there's no proof, and it may be nonsense. And my first talk I gave last week, a guy said, never gonna happen. But I do have a strong sense that in a city where you have Jewish stories, Muslim stories, Christian stories that are very siloed, I guess is the term, very restricted, like in what you can say about who does what, when, and who owns what. That the science that's been done in Jerusalem over the past 150 years, although, granted, as we've seen, it's all wrapped up in politics, religion, it's used by politicians, it's used by people to bolster their faith. This is all true. But there's still this sense I have that this science can provide us with another larger, messier, more interesting way of seeing the history of Jerusalem that can explain, I think, far better why this place has been a center of such religious innovation, why it is so fought over, why people feel so strongly about it. And I don't think this will happen next year. And I think of things like the theory of evolution that took a century or more for people to begin to accept as something that is part of a worldview that doesn't have to contradict religious belief. So I think over time, the work that's being done, the research that appears in these kind of dusty journals that doesn't make it into the newspapers will nevertheless give us a fresh sense of what this place is, and maybe, possibly, give people a sense of a city that has to be, and has always been shared. Thank you. And so being Geographic and the National Geographic Society, as well as Simon I mentioned before, Israeli Antiquities Authority, they were very patient. Now I'd love to be able to take on some questions from the audience, and then we will turn to our online audience. So just raise your hand, and if you would stand up, please, that would be great. Come on. Yes, sir.
Yes, so you were talking about the Via Sacra as being built by Pontius Pilate, and you said that there was evidence that he was actually glorifying Judaism in building that. I'm wondering if you could speak as to how you know that.
Great. So the question is about the Via Sacra, which is a term that's actually a Roman road that in Rome that goes up to the Capitoline Hill. And his question is, how do you know that Pontius Pilate was actually glorifying Judaism by building this? And the answer is, no, I don't know that. I got that from the archaeologist who has been working on the material culture from the tunnel for some time. And we don't know that he was glorifying Judaism, but we do know that he was spending a lot of time and effort and money to build a road that clearly was going up to the most important site of Judaistic worship. And now you've got to keep in mind that Pontius Pilate doesn't mean he's a good guy. It does mean that perhaps the glory would be reflected on him, because any good Roman leader who was in charge of a city wanted to glorify the city, wanted to make it look better. But clearly Pontius Pilate took the Judaism seriously and understood that, hey, we want to build a place for the pilgrims to come up from the Pool of Siloam up to the temple, and he supported that. So it really is a bit at odds with some of the writings we have from, say, Josephus, who paint him in totally negative terms. I think he's a more complicated person, and the Romans played a more complicated role in that time of Jewish history than is often given credit for. Yes?
Did the Romans ever build a temple to Jupiter in Jerusalem? Because that's typically what they did when they occupied you, to keep your religion, but you had to pray to Jupiter because that represented the empire.
Great question. So the question is, did the Romans build a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount? Great question. We don't have any clear answer because no archaeology of any substance has been done on the Acropolis. It's not allowed by the Muslim clerics who were there, nor would Israeli security probably allow that kind of digging to go on. So we don't have any archaeological evidence for it. Now, there are writings that suggest that there was a temple, and typically the Romans, so the city was destroyed, then the Romans came back in about 132 or so AD. Hadrian, the emperor, decided to rebuild it. And so they rebuilt Jerusalem as kind of a Western Roman city with a completely different street layout, a completely different form. And when you go to Jerusalem today, you walk the Via Dolorosa, for example, you're walking Roman streets that post-date the Judean city, which many people didn't know 100 years ago. Now we do know that. Probably there was a temple. And also I want to note that during the time of the Jewish temple, the last Jewish temple, the Jewish priests certainly were sacrificing to the emperor. That was, you were part of the Roman Empire, you had to pay obeisance to the emperor, so they were doing that. But no doubt there was some kind of worship going on to Roman deities. And the Christians, however, kind of left it alone, which is interesting. That's another story. Yes, sir.
How many times was Jerusalem destroyed and rebuilt?
How many times was Jerusalem destroyed and rebuilt? Well, we know that it was sacked a couple of times even before the Babylonians arrived in 586. So the Israelites, that's the first evidence we have. Well, we'll go back to the Egyptians, like 1500 BC or so. The Egyptians came in, we don't know the extent of destruction. Then the Israelites, again, don't know the extent of destruction, but clearly there was some. Then there were others that came in until the Babylonians really wiped things out. We know that both in the biblical account as well as archaeological evidence, which is really clear that most of the city was destroyed. And then the Romans, certainly in 70 CE, and then you have the Persians, who did a lot of damage. How much is a matter of big debate. And you also have, let's see, well, then the Crusaders came in, did some damage. So there's been innumerable sieges and attacks on Jerusalem, but I'd say only twice was it really heavily destroyed. Yes, sir.
So what's the story that didn't make it in the book that you really wish it made?
Oh, what's the story that didn't make it into the book? I really wish made it into the book. Well, I do make mention of this, but you know, most of the digging that's going on in Jerusalem is not done by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. It's not done by Israeli archaeologists. It's not done by archaeologists at all. It's done by people who live there who need an extra basement or an extra room or a little more storage. And this is the truth, because if you walk around on Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath, you'll see these big bags that are just lining the alleys, bags of dirt. So people will dig, and particularly in the Muslim quarter, which is the largest quarter, people are doing that, and they do it secretly because they know they will be fined heavily and maybe jailed by the Israeli authorities. Now that's true in Rome or Istanbul or anywhere. You know, you dig illegally, you're going to be punished if you're in an ancient city. But here, there's that layer of politics. So particularly the Muslims, as well as the Christian Arabs, have a lot of reason not to let the Israelis know what they're doing. So an immense amount of data is being lost. And that's really a shame. And it's really one of the most unfortunate aspects of the conflict in Jerusalem. We don't know what's being lost, but I did see lots of bags, and I talked to a lot of people, and I visited some basements, and I saw what was being dug out. And there's really little that can be done. Until the conflict is resolved, people are going to continue digging secretly. Yes, sir.
That dovetails with my question. I suppose you've discovered a lot about the black market in your research, having to do with relics and whatnot.
Yeah, good question. So the question's about the black market in Jerusalem. Now, Israeli law is unusually lenient or liberal, I could say, when it comes to selling ancient artifacts. This is not true in most of that part of the world. It's strictly illegal. The Israelis have taken a different approach. Their approach is, hey, people are going to sell this stuff anyway, we might as well regulate it somewhat. Whether that works or not, the question. But certainly in Jerusalem, it doesn't work too well because if you dig in your basement, and I talked to one man who had found some fascinating objects he showed me, including this beautiful Byzantine medallion, a very early Arab Muslim coin that's quite rare, and other bits and pieces that I'm not an archaeologist, but I could tell were quite valuable. And he was taking them to the local guy down the street who sells them in his shop to Western tourists who arrive wanting to take back a little bit of biblical Jerusalem. You know? So the more things change, the more they don't change in Jerusalem. People still go there. And I have to admit, I did the first time I went in the 1990s before I wrote about archaeology, I did buy a beautiful Roman spear point, which I don't know what to do with it now. It's horrifying that I have it because obviously it was illegally done. So this is a really big issue that dovetails with the question of these illegal digs going on underneath the city. Okay, other question? Yes, sir.
In your research, have you found that one side or the other has engaged in deliberately destroying artifacts or damaging archaeological finds to support their narrative of the history of that region?
Great question. So the question is, has either side destroyed evidence, basically, that doesn't fit in with their historical narrative? The answer is yes, this has happened. I don't think on a large scale, but I think it's more subtle than, say, bulldozing those, oh my God, palaces, which didn't happen. It's a subtler thing. So if you find something from, say, the Byzantine times, it just doesn't have the same currency as finding something from biblical times. Now, is that because of the strength of the Jewish or Christian narrative? Because Western Christians tend not to really care much about the Byzantine period. They want New Testament stuff and Old Testament stuff. So I think the real issue is, how do we take the data that's been found and integrate them into our narratives rather than trying to take the data, and often it gets twisted into a narrative, or at least it gets absorbed into a narrative in a way that doesn't really reflect the science. And I point the finger at archaeologists, because I think archaeologists in Jerusalem have a responsibility to point out the deficiencies in the way their work is being used. They can actually have a voice, but they're afraid because their jobs often are government jobs. So it's not an easy matter. It's not as simple as destroying evidence. I think it's a question of how you interpret that evidence, and can we find ways to bring it into narratives and understand that it doesn't have to wreck a story. It doesn't have to prove anything. It can just give us a more detailed and a more real glimpse into life of the past. Okay, maybe one more question here? Yes.
With the many layers of Jerusalem, and then the earth shifting over thousands of years, how do you know which time period you found or dug, or what direction it's going in?
Great question. So, how do you know basically how to date things? It's really in essence. And this has been one of the biggest problems in Jerusalem, partly because it's stone, so there's not a lot of wood. And wood you can date, you can radiocarbon date, it's organic. But when it comes to stone, you can't date that. So Jerusalem has been very problematic in nailing down some of these eras, such as the era of David and Solomon. And also because biblical archaeologists in Jerusalem have been very conservative. They're a very traditional conservative bunch. They don't like to use new methods. They don't use those new methods easily, I should say. So only in the past decade or two have they begun to use radiocarbon and able to extract small organic samples that could give them dates. So there's really a lot of new science out there in archaeology that could be used in Jerusalem that hasn't, because of this obsession with, say, finding a seal that's linked to Isaiah, or finding, here's something related to this person in the Bible. And most archaeologists say that's not really very interesting. We want to know about how people lived. We want to know how they died. What were their illnesses? What did they eat? Who did they trade with? These are the real questions that archaeologists today ask. And only now are those questions getting asked in Jerusalem. So I think in the coming years, we're going to see a lot more interesting data that gives us this better sense of who did what when. Shall we go to online?
Just as a kind of a wrapping up question, is it too soon to ask you what we might expect from you next? And if it's not too soon, what's next? Please.
Oh, no. Yeah, the question is about what's next. And let's just say that the pandemic has given me a lot of reason to focus back on American history, because it doesn't involve very long plane rides wearing masks and subsisting on water and a cookie for an 8-hour flight. So I'm looking at something related to early American history, not as early as Roanoke, but that's in the early stages. And I hope to have you all back here in 2 or 3 years, and you'll know
What a mystery, tantalizing.
Yeah.
Jay.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This is a wonderful turnout. There are probably 50 people who are watching this online, and it's just really gratifying. I have just a few thanks, and I do want to let you know again that Malaprops is selling these books. We thought about actually not letting people leave unless they had proof. You didn't have to have proof of vaccination, but I think it would be good if you had proof of buying this book. I can avoid it. I want to thank Sharon Farr for alerting us to this opportunity in the first place, and to Malaprop's Stephanie and her colleagues, to Rochelle Rich, who is the executive director here at CBI, for her help, and the JCC and CBHT for helping to promote this, and of course to Andrew and Elizabeth both
And to all of you, thanks so much for coming out. It's nice to know that we can get this kind of a crowd even with the pandemic. It's just wonderful.